id over here, and then there's the ego over here, which is in contact with the real world, and then the superego on top here, controlling from above, with the sense of morality and so forth and so on, which we don't need to go into. But the point is that Freud had this idea of a mental apparatus. Now, the mental apparatus is a pure abstraction. And it's absolutely true, as Philip said, that Freud always believed that the mind had a physiological basis. And if you read, for example, the modern editions of Freud's three essays on sexuality, which were very important text for Reich in developing vegetotherapy and orgone therapy, you can see by reading the footnotes and seeing the different editions that had first in 1905, then 1910 and 1912, and then there are some additional footnotes in the 1920s. There's a footnote there about endocrinology, where Freud, I think it's probably from the teens, from 12 maybe, where Freud reports recent experiments done in endocrinology having to do with thyroid hormone and having to do with sex hormones, what we would call estrogen and testosterone and progesterone. He was discovering these things in the early century, 20th century. And Freud was very interested in these things because he had this idea initially that anxiety was some kind of a chemical breakdown product of libido. And then later on he had the idea that sex hormones and other kinds of hormones could eventually explain some of the neurotic phenomena that he was seeing. And it's also true that he wrote this, what we now call the Project of Scientific Psychology, where and then the neuron had just been discovered. So here was Freud taking this new discovery, the neuron, and saying, well, hey, maybe there are different kinds of neurons that correspond on the one hand to sexual impulses, and on the other hand to repression, and then maybe a third kind of neuron which has to do with consciousness. And maybe I can work this all out. Then he abandoned it.
Id neurons, ego neurons, and superego neurons.
Well, why not? But at a certain point, Freud came to the conclusion that this was a futile direction. And in the meantime, Reich was finding his own direction in physiology and biology. But Freud gave it up and continued till the end of his life to work with a pure abstraction of a mental apparatus, not knowing that there was something in the brain and in the body which corresponded to this apparatus, but the apparatus itself was totally abstract. And similarly, the idea of libido was an abstraction. And one of the most common criticisms of psychoanalysts against Reich was that he concretized or reified the libido. I mean, what's so terrible about that? But it's true that for Freud, the libido was an abstract concept, that he knew that there were chemical and physiological processes in the body which gave rise to the libido, but for Freud, the idea of an instinct was a concept. How do you call a concept which straddles two different realms of something? I mean, it was on the borderline. That's it. It's a borderline concept between the mind and the body. So we knew that the libido came from the body, but it wasn't physical. Libido was somehow some mental representation or effect of something in the body which gave rise to libido, which was a drive. But the drive was a borderline concept. It wasn't really physical, and it wasn't really totally mental. It was like nowhere. And so Freud was operating with an abstract mental apparatus and a metaphorical, you could say, drive concept. And so it's very hard for orgone therapists and psychoanalysts to talk to each other.
In my second talk, I'm going to focus more on libido. Can we turn it over to Harry, or is that the place for you to stop? Or
no, I want to make two more.
Oh, okay.
I want to make two more quick points. Just three more quick points. One is.
One quick statement to add anything about Freud's neurology.
Yeah, go ahead.
there have been a recent number of neurobiological studies in which they've come back to Freud's original idea and pointed out that he probably was right, except he didn't know how it actually works. That there are specific neurological correlatives to the unconscious.
Absolutely.
And to what Reich called libido.
Well, at my institute, there's a whole section now of neuropsychoanalysis that meets every Saturday and invites neuroscientists to come and speak and show how certain new discoveries in neuroscience correlate with Freudian concepts. But it's getting to the point where psychoanalysts can't talk to each other because you have the purists, the traditionalists who say, well, no, the mental apparatus is an abstraction. Libido is a metaphor, and the other guy said, no, we can't stick with that because that's too old-fashioned. We have all these new findings in neurobiology that we have to incorporate. But let me quickly make a few other points. One is that Philip's description of how psychoanalysis works is accurate, for the old days. But in modern times, it's not just making the unconscious conscious and abreacting. It's a little bit closer to the character analytic point of view in the sense that they try to resolve mental conflict in general. And it's not necessarily so important whether something becomes conscious or not. What's really important is whether the mind becomes freed of excessive conflict and has a maximum capacity for emotional and creative expression. In psychoanalysis, sublimation is not a dirty word because sublimation is considered one of the relatively free ways in which sexual energy can be discharged without damaging civilization. But of course, it's absolutely true that Freud was himself terrified of infantile sexuality and considered it a potentially destructive force. And that, in my opinion, is one of the main differences in point of view and in temperament between Reich and Freud. Freud was not a conservative. He was not for the status quo, but he was terrified of that particular form of energy as it has an impact on society. That's absolutely true. There are two concepts which are not, as far as I can see, discussed very often by orgone therapists, and one of them is narcissism, and the other is object relations. And each of those could be a full-day conference in itself. We're going to have one. But just very briefly, the idea of narcissism, and this also is very beautifully presented in the paper about Ferenczi in 1913 on the stages in the sense of reality, where he describes, as Freud had already described, that the infant, the newborn infant, feels omnipotent. And the newborn infant soon realizes that he or she is not omnipotent. At first there's a fantasy that whatever you want comes to you in the form of mother's milk or the parents' care for you. And the baby has the feeling that everything is happening according to his or her wishes. And Freud had this wonderful phrase to describe the newborn boy as His Majesty the infant, or His Majesty the baby. I forget exactly what it was. And then the baby soon realizes it's not happening, and as a compensation for it, the baby then projects its own grandiosity and omnipotence onto the parent. So the parent then becomes the omnipotent figure, or the adult more generally. And then later on, the narcissism becomes a terrible problem because you realize, because you want to hold on to it, but you can't. And how the narcissism is involved with sexuality is a great problem in psychoanalysis because sexuality doesn't take on we see sexuality in the different phases of psychosexual development, the oral, the anal, and then the phallic, and so on. But it's not clear exactly how the narcissistic need for omnipotence is intertwined with the sexual need. And this also has to do with aggression, because omnipotence involves power. You want the person to do what is going to be pleasurable for you and make you feel omnipotent and good about yourself. And I think that has a bearing on morality also, because to say that what is natural is what is good and what is moral does not take into account necessarily the need for omnipotence which human beings feel, and the narcissistic vulnerability that we all feel when we are dissed or deprived. And that may be in addition to the Rice concept of armoring and the concept of the secondary layer developing out of armoring. I think, to be honest with ourselves, we may have to take into account the idea of omnipotence and narcissism. And finally, in the realm of object relations, Freud, certainly by the 1920s, Freud gave a great importance to the idea of identification. Identification as a form of defense, and as a way of dealing with conflict, internal conflict. And in the Oedipus, when you had, and we may touch later on the question of whether the Oedipus complex is universal or not, but when it occurs and when it has to be dealt with, according to Freud, the little boy, for example, a little Oedipal boy at age 3, 4, 5, whatever, deals with it. He hates his father because his father is his competitor. He loves his mother. I mean, that's the positive Oedipus complex. He is also the negative one where he loves the father and competes with the mother. But in the classical positive Oedipus configuration, he wants to get rid of his father so he can have his mother to himself. How does he deal with this? He internalizes or identifies with his father, and he becomes like his father, and he imagines that someday, like his father, he will have a wife like his mother. And then he's able, by internalizing the father, he's able to gain something in omnipotence, in feeling of goodness, in feeling of, in the case of the boy, of masculinity, and he's able to renounce, to a large extent, his drive to possess his mother. In the meantime, he has built up psychic structure. And in this case, the psychic structure he's built up is his superego. This is his conscience, his morality. So here, again, a basic difference. Freud emphasizes the formation of psychic structure through identification, through internalization of other aspects of important people in our lives. And Reich de-emphasizes it, and very much de-emphasizes the importance of the superego as a structure and as an aspect of civilization. For Freud, the superego is not only the regulator of moral behavior, but it's also the way that civilization and its values are transmitted from generation to generation. For Reich, it is a totally different concept, and I'm going to stop here because obviously I'm myself conflicted about which of these approaches is the right one, and I wish we had a way of incorporating the best from each system, so to speak.
Thanks a lot, Alan. One thing I left out is in 1927, Malinowski, the anthropologist, published a book designed to direct critique of psychoanalysis on this issue of the Oedipus complex, and they claimed that it was universal, and Reich was very much taken with this. And Reich and Malinowski go on to become very good friends, and they arranged their schedules so they both taught at the same night at the New School. Malinowski was then at Yale in New Haven, would come down to the city and teach one course on the same night, because I went and looked at the catalog. On the same night when Reich was teaching, so you can imagine them going out to the Cedar Tavern for a beer and a steak. Dr. Lewis, you're on for 15, please. And we're running a little behind time, so if you can...
I know, you told me to keep my mouth shut.
Well, I gave you these slots so you wouldn't interrupt, but go ahead. You got, but if you can keep it to like...
No,